The Last Guest. In a small American town around 19, two old ladies are chatting. Mrs. Musser tells Mrs. Emerson that a new family is moving to the town's haunted house. Mrs. Emerson doesn't believe in ghosts. Then Mrs. Musser tells her the story of what happened to her when she lived in that house. When Mrs. Musser arrived in town to teach in school, she went on to board with Mrs. Dennison and Mrs. Bird, who were living in that house. One evening, she heard knocking at the door. When she opened the door, she felt a draft of cold air, and she saw a strange child who was floating in the air, saying, "I can't find my mother," and repeated the same phrase whatever she asked. When the child disappeared, Mrs. Musser ran to the two old ladies and told them of the child. They told her that they had already seen her. A few days later, Mrs. Bird got sick, and Mrs. Musser, one morning, going downstairs, asked Mrs. Dennison about Mrs. Bird. Mrs. Dennison answered that Mrs. Bird didn't feel well. After 2 minutes, they both looked out the window and saw the child, hand in hand Mrs. Bird. Mrs. Bird was dead. After this tale, Mrs. Emerson started to believe in ghosts.
Created using Powtoon.